The Mystery of Cloomber by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 14th. Of the visitor who ran down the road in the night time. It was 10:15 by the parlour timepiece when my father went off to his room and left Esther and myself together. We heard his slow steps dying away up the creaking staircase until the distant slamming of a door announced that he had reached his sanctum. The simple oil lamp upon the table threw a weird, uncertain light over the old room, flickering upon the carved oak paneling and casting strange, fantastic shadows from the high-elbowed, straight-backed furniture. My sister's white, anxious face stood out in the obscurity with a startling exactness of profile like one of Rembrandt's portraits. We sat opposite to each other on either side of the table, with no sound breaking the silence save the measured ticking of the clock and the intermittent chirping of a cricket beneath the gate. There was something awe-inspiring in the absolute stillness. The whistling of a belated peasant upon the high road was a relief to us, and we strained our ears to catch the last of his notes as he plodded steadily homewards. At first we had made some pretense, she of knitting and I of reading, but we soon abandoned the useless deception and sat uneasily waiting, starting and glancing at each other with questioning eyes whenever the faggot cracked in the fire or a rat scampered behind the wainscot. There was a heavy electrical feeling in the air which weighed us down with a foreboding of disaster. I rose and flung the hall door open to admit the fresh breeze of the night. Ragged clouds swept across the sky, and the moon peeped out at times between their hurrying fringes, bathing the whole countryside in its cold white radiance. From where I stood in the doorway, I could see the edge of the Cloomber wood, though the house itself was only visible from the rising ground some little distance off. At my sister's suggestion, we walked together, she with her shawl over her head, as far as the summit of this elevation, and looked out in the direction of the hall. There was no illumination of the windows tonight. From roof to basement, not a light twinkled in any part of the great building. Its huge mass loomed up dark and sullen amid the trees which surrounded it, looking more like some giant sarcophagus than a human habitation. To our overwrought nerves there was something of terror in its mere bulk and its silence. We stood for some little time peering at it through the darkness, and then we made our way back to the parlour again, where we sat waiting. We knew not for what, and yet with absolute conviction that some terrible experience was in store for us. It was 12 or thereabout, when my sister suddenly sprang to her feet and held up her fingers to bespeak attention. "Do you hear nothing?" she asked. I strained my ears, but without success. "Come to the door," she cried with a trembling voice. "Now can you hear anything?" In the deep silence of the night, I distinctly heard a dull, murmuring, clattering sound, continuous apparently, but very faint and low. "What is it?" I asked in a subdued voice. "It's the sound of a man running toward us," she answered, and then suddenly, dropping the last semblance of self-command, she fell upon her knees beside the table and began praying aloud with that frenzied earnestness which intense, overpowering fear can produce, breaking off now and then into half-hysterical whimperings. I could distinguish the sound clearly enough now to know that her quick, feminine perception had not deceived her, and that it was indeed caused by a running man. On he came, and on down the high road, his footfalls ringing out clearer and sharper every moment. An urgent messenger he must be, for he neither paused nor slackened his pace. The quick, crisp rattle was changed suddenly to a dull, muffled murmur. He had reached the point where sand had been recently laid down for 100 yards or so. In a few moments, however, he was back on hard ground again, and his flying feet came nearer and ever nearer. He must, I reflected, be abreast of the head of the lane now. Would he hold on, or would he turn down to Branksome? The thought had hardly crossed my mind when I heard the difference of the sound that the runner had turned the corner, and that his goal was beyond all question the laird's house. Rushing down to the gate of the lawn, I reached it just as our visitor dashed it open and fell into my arms. I could see it in the moonlight. It was none other than Mordaunt Heatherstone. "What has happened?" I cried. "What is amiss, Mordaunt?" "My father," he gasped. "My father!" His hat was gone, his eyes dilated with terror, and his face as bloodless as that of a corpse. I could feel that the hands which clasped my arms were quivering and shaking with emotion. "You are exhausted," I said, leading him into the parlor. "Give yourself a moment's rest before you speak to us. Be calm, man. You are with your best friends." I laid him on the old horsehair sofa, while Esther, whose fears had all flown to the winds now that something practical was to be done, dashed some brandy into a tumbler and brought it to him. The stimulant had a marvelous effect upon him, for the color began to come back into his pale cheeks, and the light of recognition in his eyes. He sat up and took Esther's hand in both of his, like a man who is waking out of some bad dream and wishes to assure himself that he really is in safety. "Your father," I asked, "what of him?" "He is gone." "Gone?" "Yes, he is gone, and so is Corporal Rufus Smith. We shall never set eyes upon them again." "But where have they gone?" I cried. "This is unworthy of you, Mordaunt. What right have we to sit here allowing our private feelings to overcome us, while there is a possibility of succouring your father? Up, man! Let us follow him. Tell me only what direction he took." "It's no use," young Heatherstone answered, burying his face in his hands. "Don't reproach me, West, for you don't know all the circumstances. What can we do to reverse the tremendous and unknown laws which are acting against us? The blow has long been hanging over us, and now it has fallen. God help us." "In heaven's name, tell me what has happened," I said excitedly. "We must not yield to despair." "We can do nothing until daybreak," he answered. "We shall then endeavor to obtain some trace of them. It is hopeless at present." "And how about Gabriel and Mrs. Heatherstone?" I asked. "Can we not bring them down from the hall at once? Your poor sister must be distracted with terror." "She knows nothing of it," Mordaunt answered. "She sleeps at the other side of the house, and has not heard or seen anything. As to my poor mother, she has expected some such event for so long a time that he has not come upon her as a surprise. She is, of course, overwhelmed with grief, but would, I think, prefer to be left to herself for the present. Her firmness and composure should be a lesson to me, but I am constitutionally excitable, and this catastrophe coming after a long period of suspense deprived me of my very reason for a time." "If we can do nothing until the morning," I said, "you have time to tell us what has occurred." "I will do so," he answered, rising and holding his shaking hands to the fire. "You know already that we have had reason for some time, for many years, in fact, to fear that a terrible retribution was hanging over my father's head for a certain action of his early life. In this action he was associated with the man known as Corporal Rufus Smith, so that the fact of the latter finding his way to my father was a warning to us that the time had come, and that this 5th of October, the anniversary of the misdeed, would be the day of its atonement. I told you of our fears in my letter, and, if I am not mistaken, my father also had some conversation with you, John, upon the subject. When I saw yesterday morning that he had hunted out the old uniform, which he had always retained since he wore it in the Afghan War, I was sure that the end was at hand, and that our forebodings would be realized. He appeared to be more composed in the afternoon than I have seen him for years, and spoke freely of his life in India, and of the incidents of his youth. About 9 o'clock he requested us to go up to our own rooms, and locked us in there, a precaution which he frequently took when the dark fit weigh upon him. It was always his endeavour, poor soul, to keep us clear of the curse which had fallen upon his own unfortunate head. Before parting from us, he tenderly embraced my mother and Gabriel, and he afterwards followed me to my room, where he clasped my hand affectionately and gave into my charge a small packet addressed to yourself. To me, I interrupted. To you. I shall fulfill my commission when I have told you my story. I conjured him to allow me to sit up with him and share any danger which might arise, but he implored me with irresistible earnestness not to add to his troubles by thwarting his arrangements. Seeing that I was really distressing him by my pertinacity, I at last allowed him to close the door and to turn the key upon the outside. I shall always reproach myself for my want of firmness. But what can you do when your own father refuses your assistance or cooperation? You cannot force yourself upon him. I am sure that you did all that you could, my sister said. I meant to, dear Esther, but God help me. It was hard to tell what was right. He left me, and I heard his footsteps die away down the long corridor. It was then about 10 o'clock or a little after. For a time I paced up and down the room, and then, carrying the lamp to the head of my bed, I lay down without undressing, reading St. Thomas à Kempis and praying from my heart that the night might pass safely over us. I had at last fallen into a troubled sleep when I was suddenly aroused by a loud, sonorous sound ringing in my ears. I sat up bewildered, but all was silent again. The lamp was burning low, and my watch showed me that it was going on to midnight. I blundered to my feet and was striking a match with the intention of lighting the candles, when the sharp, vehement cry broke out again so loud and so clear that it might have been in the very room with me. My chamber is in the front of the house, while those of my mother and sister are at the back, so I am the only one who commands a view of the avenue. Rushing to the window, I drew the blind aside and looked out. You know that the gravel drive opens up, so as to form a broad stretch immediately in front of the house. Just in the center of this clear space, there stood 3 men looking up at the house. The moon shone full upon them, glistening on their upturned eyeballs, and by its light I could see that they were swarthy-faced and black-haired, of a type that I was familiar with among the Sikhs and Afridis. 2 of them were thin, with eager, aesthetic countenances, while the third was king-like and majestic, with a noble figure and a flowing beard. "Ram Singh," I ejaculated. "What? You know of them?" exclaimed Mordaunt in great surprise. "You have met them?" "I know of them. They are Buddhist priests," I answered. "But go on." "They stood in a line," he continued, "sweeping their arms upward and downwards, while their lips moved as if repeating some prayer or incantation. Suddenly they ceased to gesticulate and broke out for the 3rd time into the wild, weird, piercing cry which had roused me from my slumber. Never shall I forget that shrill, dreadful summons, swelling and reverberating throughout the silent night, with an intensity of sound which is still ringing in my ears. As it died slowly away, there was a rasping and creaking as of keys and bolts, followed by the clang of an opening door and the clatter of hurrying feet. From my window I saw my father and Corporal Rufus Smith rush frantically out of the house, hatless and unkempt, like men who are obeying a sudden and overpowering impulse. The 3 strangers laid no hands on them, but all 5 swept swiftly away down the avenue and vanished among the trees. I am positive that no force was used or constraint of any visible kind, and yet I am as sure that my poor father and his companion were helpless prisoners, as I had seen them dragged away in manacles. All this took little time in the acting. From the first summons which disturbed my sleep to the last shadowy glimpse which I had of them between the tree trunks could hardly have occupied more than 5 minutes of actual time. So sudden was it and so strange that when the drama was over and they were gone, I could have believed that it was all some terrible nightmare, some delusion, had I not felt that the impression was too real, too vivid to be imputed to fancy. I threw my whole weight against my bedroom door in the hope of forcing the lock. It stood firm for a while, but I flung myself upon it again and again until something snapped and I found myself in the passage. My first thought was for my mother. I rushed to her room and turned the key in her door. The moment that I did so, she stepped out into the corridor, into her dressing gown, and held up a warning finger. "No noise," she said. "Gabriel is asleep. They have been called away." "They have?" I answered. "God's will be done," she cried. "Your poor father will be happier in the next world than he has ever been in this. Thank heaven that Gabriel is asleep." I gave her coral and her cocoa. "What am I to do?" I said distractedly. "Where have they gone? How can I help him? We cannot let him go from us like this, or leave these men to do what they will with him. Shall I ride into Wigtown and arouse the police?" "Anything rather than that," my mother said earnestly. "He has begged me again and again to avoid it. My son, we shall never set eyes upon your father again. You may marvel at my dry eyes, but if you knew as I know the peace which death would bring him, you could not find it in your heart to mourn for him. All pursuit is, I feel, vain, and yet some pursuit there must be. Let it be as private as possible. We cannot serve him better than by consulting his wishes." "But every minute is precious," I cried. "Even now he may be calling upon us to rescue him from the clutches of those dark-skinned fiends." The thought so maddened me that I rushed out of the house and down to the high road, but once there I had no indication in which direction to turn. The whole wide moor lay before me without a sign of movement upon its broad expanse. I listened, but not a sound broke the perfect stillness of the night. It was then, my dear friends, as I stood not knowing in which direction to turn, that the horror and responsibility broke full upon me. I felt that I was combating against forces which I knew nothing. All was strange and dark and terrible. The thought of you and of the help which I might look for from your advice and assistance was a beacon of hope to me. At Branksome, at least, I should receive sympathy and, above all, directions as to what I should do. For my mind is in such a whirl that I cannot trust my own judgment. My mother was content to be alone, my sister asleep, and no prospect of being able to do anything until daybreak. Under those circumstances, what more natural than that I should fly to you as fast as my feet would carry me? You have a clear head, Jack. Speak out, man, and tell me what I should do. Esther, what should I do?" He turned from one to the other of us with outstretched hands and eager, questioning eyes. "You can do nothing while the darkness lasts," I answered. "We must report the matter to the Wigtown police, but we need not send our message to them until we are actually starting upon the search, so as to comply with the law and yet have a private investigation, as your mother wishes. John Fullerton over the hill has a lurcher dog, which is as good as a bloodhound. If we set him on the general's trail, he will run him down if he had to follow him to John or Groat's. It is terrible to wait calmly here while he may need our assistance. I fear our assistance could under any circumstances do him little good. There are forces at work here which are beyond human intervention. Besides, there is no alternative. We have, apparently, no possible clue as to the direction which they have taken, and for us to wander aimlessly over the moor in the darkness would be to waste the strength which may be more profitably used in the morning. It will be daylight by 5 o'clock. In an hour or so we can walk over the hill together and get Fullerton's dog." "Another hour," Mordaunt groaned. "Every minute seems an age." "Lie down on the sofa and rest yourself," said I. "You cannot serve your father better than by laying up all the strength you can, for we may have a weary trudge before us. But you mentioned a packet, which the General had intended for me." "It is here," he answered, drawing a small flat parcel from his pocket and handing it over to me. "You will find, no doubt, that it will explain all which has been so mysterious." The packet was sealed at each end with black wax, bearing the impress of the flying griffin, which I knew to be the General's crest. It was further secured by a band of broad tape, which I cut with my pocket knife. Across the outside was written in bold handwriting, "J. Fothergill West, Esquire," and underneath, "To be handed to that gentleman in the event of the disappearance or decease of Major General J.B. Heatherstone, V.C., C.B., late of the Indian Army." So at last I was to know the dark secret which had cast a shadow over our lives. Here in my hands I held the solution of it. With eager fingers I broke the seals and undid the wrapper. A note and a small bundle of discolored paper lay within. I drew the lamp over to me and opened the former. It was dated the preceding afternoon and ran in this way. "My dear West, I should have satisfied your very natural curiosity on the subject which we have had occasion to talk of more than once, but I refrained for your own sake. I knew by sad experience how unsettling and unnerving it is to be forever waiting for a catastrophe which you are convinced must befall, in which you can neither avert nor accelerate. Though it affects me specially as being the person most concerned, I am still curious that the natural sympathy which I have observed in you and your regard for Gabriel's father would both combine to render you unhappy if you knew the hopelessness and yet the vagueness of the fate which threatens me. I feared to disturb your mind, and I was therefore silent, though at some cost to myself, for my isolation has not been the least of the troubles which have weighed me down. Many signs, however, and chief among them the presence of the Buddhists upon the coast, as described by you this morning, have convinced me that the weary waiting is at last over, and that the hour of retribution is at hand. Why should I have been allowed to live nearly 40 years after my offense is more than I can understand. But it is possible that those who had command over my fate know that such a life is the greatest of all penalties to me. Never for an hour, night or day, have they suffered me to forget that they have marked me down as their victim. Their accursed astral bell has been ringing my knell for 20 years, reminding me ever that there is no spot upon earth where I can hope to be in safety. Oh, the peace, the blessed peace of dissolution. Come what may on the other side of the tomb, I shall at last be quit of that thrice terrible sound. There is no need for me to enter into the wretched business again, or to detail at any length the events of October 5th, 1841, and the various circumstances which led up to the death of Gulab Shah, the arch-adept. I have torn a sheaf of leaves from my old journal in which you will find a bald account of the matter, and an independent narrative was furnished by Sir Edward Elliot of the Artillery to the Star of India some years ago, in which, however, the names were suppressed. I have reason to believe that many people, even among those who knew India well, thought that Sir Edward was romancing, and that he had evolved his incidents from his imagination. The few faded sheets which I send you will show you that this is not the case, and that our men of science must recognize powers and laws which can and have been used by man, but which are unknown to European civilization. I do not wish to whine or to whimper, but I cannot help feeling that I have had a hard measure dealt me in this world. I would not, God knows, take the life of any man, far less an aged one, in cold blood. My temper and nature, however, were always fiery and headstrong, and in action, when my blood is up, I have no knowledge of what I am about. Neither the corporal nor I would have laid a finger upon Gulab Shah had we not seen that the tribesmen were rallying behind him. Well, it is an old story now, and there is no profit in discussing it. May no other poor fellow ever have the same evil fortune. I have written a short supplement to the statements contained in my journal for your information and that of anyone else who may chance to be interested in the matter. And now, adieu. Be a good husband to Gabriel, and if your sister be brave enough to marry into such a devil-ridden family as ours, by all means let her do so. I have left enough to keep my poor wife in comfort. When she rejoins me, I should wish it to be equally divided between the children. If you hear that I am gone, do not pity, but congratulate. Your unfortunate friend, John Berthier Heatherstone. I threw aside the letter and picked up the roll of blue fool's cap which contained the solution of the mystery. It was all ragged and frayed at the inner edge, with traces of gum and thread still adhering to it, to show that it had been torn out of a strongly bound volume. The ink with which it had been written was faded somewhat, but across the head of the first page was inscribed in bold, clear letters, evidently of later date than the rest, Journal of Lieutenant J.B. Heatherstone in the Thull Valley during the autumn of 1841. And then underneath, this extract contained some account of the events of the first week of October of that year, including the skirmish of the Tarada Ravine and the death of the man Gulab Shah. I have the narrative lying before me now, and I copy it verbatim. If it contains some matter which has no direct bearing upon the question at issue, I can only say that I thought it better to publish what is irrelevant than by cutting and clipping to lay the whole statement open to the charge of having been tampered with. End of chapter. Read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Mystery of Cloomber by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 15. The Day Book of John Berthier Heatherstone. Thull Valley, October 1, 1841. The 5th Bengal and 33rd Queens passed through this morning on their way to the front. Had tiffin with the Bengalese. Latest news from home that 2 attempts have been made on the Queen's life by semi-maniacs named Francis and Bean. It promises to be a hard winter. The snow line has descended 1,000 feet upon the peaks, but the passes will be open for weeks to come, and even if they were blocked, we have established so many depots in the country that Pollock and Knott will have no difficulty in holding their own. They shall not meet with the fate of Elphinstone's army. One such tragedy is enough for a century. Elliot of the artillery and I are answerable for the safety of the communications for a distance of 20 miles or more. From the mouth of the valley to this side of the wooden bridge over the Lotar, Goodenough of the rifles is responsible on the other side, and Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Herbert of the engineers has a general supervision over both sections. Our force is not strong enough for the work which has to be done. I have a company and a half of our own regiment and a squadron of sowars who are of no use at all among the rocks. Elliot has 3 guns, but several of his men are down with cholera, and I doubt if he has enough to serve more than 2. On the other hand, each convoy is usually provided with some guard of its own, though it is often absurdly inefficient. These valleys and ravines which branch out of the main pass are alive with Aphrodis and Pathons, who are keen robbers as well as religious fanatics. I wonder they don't stoop down on some of our caravans. They could plunder them and get back to the mountain fastness before we could interfere or overtake them. Nothing but fear will restrain them. If I had my way, I would hang one at the mouth of every ravine as a warning to the gang. They are personifications of the devil to look at, hawk-nosed, full-lipped, with a mane of tangled hair, and most satanic sneer. No news today from the front. October 2. I must really ask Herbert for another company at the very least. I am convinced that the communications would be cut off if any serious attack was made upon us. Now, this morning, 2 urgent messages were sent me from 2 different points more than 16 miles apart to say that there were signs of a descent of the tribes. Elliot, with 1 gun, and the sowars went to the farther ravine, while I, with the infantry, hurried to the other, but we found it was a false alarm. I saw no signs of the hillmen, and though we were greeted by a spurter of Jezail bullets, we were unable to capture any of the rascals. Woe betide them if they fall into my hands. I would give them as short a shrift as ever a Highland cateran got from a Glasgow judge. These continued alarms may mean nothing, or they may be an indication that the hillmen are assembling and have some plan in view. We have had no news from the front for some time, but today a convoy of wounded came through with the intelligence that Nott had taken Ghuznee. I hope he warmed up any of the black rascals that fell into his hands. No word from Pollock. An elephant battery came out from Punjab, looking in very good condition. There were several convalescents with it, going up to rejoin their regiments. Knew none of them except Mostyn of the Hussars and young Blakesley, who was my fag at Chatterhouse, and whom I have never seen since. Punch and cigars al fresco up to 11 o'clock. Letters today from Wills and Company about their little bill forwarded from Delhi. Though a campaign-free demand from these annoyances, Will says in his note that since his written applications have been in vain, he must call upon me in person. If he calls upon me now, he will assuredly be the boldest and most persevering of tailors. A line from Calcutta Daisy and another from Hobhouse to say that Matilda comes in for all the money under the will. I am glad of it. October 3. Glorious news from the front today. Barclay of the Madras Cavalry galloped through the dispatches. Pollock entered Kabul triumphantly on the 16th of last month, and better still, Lady Sale has been rescued by Shakespeare and brought safe into the British camp, together with the other hostages. Te Deum laudamus. This should end the whole wretched business. This and the sack of the city. I hope Pollock won't be squeamish or truckle to the hysterical party at home. The towns should be laid in ashes, and the fields sown with salt. Above all, the residency and the palace must come down. So shall Burns, MacNaghten, and many another gallant fellow know that his countrymen could avenge if they could not save him. It is hard when others are gaining glory and experience to be stuck in this miserable valley. I've been out of it completely, bar a few petty skirmishes. However, we may see some service yet. A jemidar of ours brought in a hillman today who says that the tribes are massing in the Tarada ravine 10 miles to the north of us and intend attacking the next convoy. We can't rely on that information of this sort, but there may prove to be some truth in it. Propose to shoot our informant so as to prevent his playing the double traitor and reporting our proceedings. Elliot demurred. If you are making war, you should throw no chance away. I hate half-and-half measures. The children of Israel seem to have been the only people who ever carried war to its logical conclusion, except Cromwell in Ireland. Made a compromise at last by which the man is to be detained as a prisoner and executed if his information proved to be false. I only hope we get a fair chance of showing what we can do. No doubt these fellows at the front will have CBs and knighthoods showering upon them thick and fast, while we poor devils, who have had most of the responsibility and anxiety, will be passed over completely. Elliot has a whitlow. The last convoy left us a large packet of sauces, but as they forgot to leave anything to eat with them, we have handed them over to the sowars, who drink them out of their pannikins as if they were liquors. We hear that another large convoy may be expected from the plains in the course of a day or two. Took 9 to 4 on Cleopatra for the Calcutta Cup. October 4. The hillmen really mean business this time, I think. We have had 2 of our spies come in this morning with the same account about the gathering at the Tarada Quarter. That old rascal Zamon is at the head of it, and I had recommended the government to present him with a telescope in return for his neutrality. There will be no Zamon to present it to if I can but lay hands upon him. We expect the convoy tomorrow morning and need anticipate no attack until it comes up. For these fellows fight for plunder, not for glory, though, to do them justice, they have plenty of pluck when they get started. I have devised an excellent plan, but it has Elliot's hearty support. By Jove, if we can only manage it, it will be as pretty a rouse as I've ever heard of. Our intention is to give out that we are going down the valley to meet the convoy and to block the mouth of a pass from which we profess to expect an attack. Very good. We shall make a night march tonight and reach their camp. Once there, I shall conceal my 200 men in the wagons and travel up with the convoy again. Our friends, the enemy, having heard that we intended to go south, and seeing the caravan going north without us, will naturally swoop down upon it under the impression that we are 20 miles away. We shall teach them such a lesson that they would as soon think of stopping a thunderbolt as of interfering again with one of Her Britannic Majesty's provision trains. I am all on thorns to be off. Elliot has rigged up 2 of his guns so ingeniously that they look more like costermongers' barrows than anything else. To see the artillery ready for action in the convoy might arouse suspicion. The artillerymen will be in the wagons next to guns, all ready to unlimber and open fire. Infantry in front and rear have told our confidential and discreet sepoy servants the plan which we do not intend to adopt. N.B. If you wish a thing to be noised over a whole province, always whisper it, under a vow of secrecy, to your confidential native servant. 8:45 p.m., just starting for the convoy. May luck go with us. October 5, 7 o'clock in the evening. Io Triumphe! Crown us with laurel, Elliot and myself. Who can compare with us as vermin killers? I've only just got back, tired and weary, stained with blood and dust, but I have sat down before either washing or changing to have the satisfaction of seeing our deeds set forth in black and white, if only in my private log, for no eye but my own. I shall describe it all fully as a presentation for an official account, which must be drawn up when Elliot gets back. Billy Dawson used to say that there were 3 degrees of comparison: a prevarication, a lie, and an official account. We at least cannot exaggerate our success, for it would be impossible to add anything to it. We set out then, as per program, and came upon the camp near the head of the valley. They had 2 weak companies of the 54th with them, who might no doubt have held their own with warning, but an unexpected rush of wild hillmen is a very difficult thing to stand against. With our reinforcements, however, and on our guard, we might defy the rascals. Chamberlain was in command, a fine young fellow. We soon made him understand the situation, and were all ready for a start by daybreak, though his wagons were so full that we were compelled to leave several tons of fodder behind in order to make room for my sepoys and for the artillery. About 5 o'clock, we inspanned, to use an Africanism, and by 6 we were well on our way, with our escort as straggling and unconcerned as possible, as helpless-looking a caravan as ever invited attack. I could soon see that it was to be no false alarm this time, and that the tribes really meant business. From my post of observation under the canvas screens of one of the wagons, I could make out turbaned heads popping up to have a look at us from among the rocks, and an occasional scout hurrying northward with the news of our approach. It was not, however, until we came abreast of the Tarada Pass, a gloomy defile bounded by gigantic cliffs, that the Aphrodis began to show in force. though they had ambushed themselves so cleverly that had we not been keenly on the lookout for them, we might have walked right into the trap. As it was, the convoy halted, upon which the hillmen, seeing that they were observed, opened a heavy but ill-directed fire upon us. I had asked Chamberlain to throw out his men in skirmishing order and to give them directions to retreat slowly upon the wagons so as to draw the Aphrodites on. The ruse succeeded to perfection. As the redcoats steadily retired, keeping behind cover as much as possible, the enemy followed them up with yells of exultation, springing from rock to rock, waving their jezails in the air, and howling like a pack of demons. With their black, contorted, mocking faces, their fierce gestures, and their fluttering garments, they would have made a study for any painter who wished to portray Milton's conception of the army of the damned. From every side they pressed in until, seeing, as they thought, nothing between them and victory, they left the shelter of the rocks and came rushing down, a furious, howling throng, with the green banner of the prophet in their van. Now was our chance, and gloriously we utilized it. From every cranny and slit of the wagons came a blaze of fire, every shot of which told among the close-packed mob. 2 or 3 score rolled over like rabbits, and the rest reeled for a moment, and then, with their chiefs at their head, came on again in a magnificent rush. It was useless, however, for undisciplined men to attempt to face such a well-directed fire. The leaders were bowled over, and the others, after hesitating for a few moments, turned and made for the rocks. It was our turn now to assume the offensive. The guns were unlimbered, and grape poured into them, while our little infantry force advanced at the double, shooting and stabbing all whom they overtook. Never had I known the tide of battle turn so rapidly and so decisively. The sullen retreat became a flight, and the flight a panic-stricken rout, until there was nothing left of the tribesmen except a scattered, demoralized rabble flying wildly to their native fastnesses for shelter and protection. I was by no means inclined to let them off cheaply now that I had them in my power. On the contrary, I determined to teach them such a lesson that the sight of a single scarlet uniform would in future be a passport in itself. We followed hard upon the track of the fugitives and entered the Tirada defile at their very heels. Having detached Chamberlain and Elliot with a company on either side to protect my wings, I pushed on with my sepoys and a handful of artillerymen, giving the enemy no time to rally or to recover themselves. We were so handicapped, however, by our stiff European uniforms and by our want of practice in climbing, that we should have been unable to overtake any of the mountaineers, had it not been for a fortunate accident. There is a smaller ravine which opens into the main pass, and in their hurry and confusion, some of the fugitives rushed down this. I saw 60 or 70 of them turn down, but I should have passed them by and continued in pursuit of the main body, had not one of my scouts come rushing up to inform me that the smaller ravine was a cul-de-sac, and that the Aphrodites who had gone up it had no possible means of getting out again, except by cutting their way through our ranks. Here was an opportunity of striking terror into the tribes. Leaving Chamberlain and Elliot to continue the pursuit of the main body, I wheeled my sepoys into the narrow path and proceeded slowly down it in extended order, covering the whole ground from cliff to cliff. Not a jackal could have passed us unseen. The rebels were caught like rats in a trap. The defile in which we found ourselves was the most gloomy and majestic that I have ever seen. On either side, naked precipices rose sheer up for 1,000 feet or more, converging upon each other so as to leave a very narrow slit of daylight above us, which was further reduced by the feathery fringe of palm trees and aloes which hung over each lip of the chasm. The cliffs were not more than a couple of 100 yards apart at the entrance, but as we advanced they grew nearer and nearer until a half-company, in close order, could hardly match abreast. A sort of twilight reigned in this strange valley, and the dim, uncertain light made the great basalt rocks loom up vague and fantastic. There was no path, and the ground was most uneven, but I pushed on briskly, cautioning my fellows to have their fingers on their triggers, for I could see that we were nearing the point where the two cliffs would form an acute angle with each other. At last we came in sight of the place. A great pile of boulders was heaped up at the very end of the pass, and among these our fugitives were skulking, entirely demoralized apparently, and incapable of resistance. They were useless as prisoners, and it was out of the question to let them go, so there was no choice but to polish them off. Waving my sword, I was leading my men on when we had a most dramatic interruption of a sort, which I have seen once or twice on the boards of Drury Lane, but never in real life. In the side of the cliff, close to the pile of stones, where the hillmen were making their last stand, there was a cave which looked more like the lair of some wild beast than a human habitation. Out of this dark archway there suddenly emerged an old man, such a very, very old man that all the other veterans whom I have seen were as chickens compared with him. His hair and beard were both as white as snow, and each reached more than halfway to his waist. His face was wrinkled and brown and ebony, a cross between a monkey and a mummy, and so thin and emaciated were his shriveled limbs that you would hardly have given him credit for having any vitality left, were it not for his eyes, which glittered and sparkled with excitement, like two diamonds in a setting of mahogany. This apparition came rushing out of the cave, and throwing himself between the fugitives and our fellows, motioned us back with as imperious a sweep of the hand as ever an emperor used to his slaves. "Men of blood!" he cried in a voice of thunder, speaking excellent English too. "This is a place for prayer and meditation, not for murder. Desist, lest the wrath of the gods fall upon you." "Stand aside, old man," I shouted. "You will meet with a hurt if you don't get out of the way." I could see that the hillmen were taking heart, and that some of my sepoys were flinching, as if they did not relish this new enemy. Clearly, I must act promptly if I wished to complete our success. I dashed forward at the head of the white artillerymen who had stuck to me. The old fellow rushed at us with his arms out as if to stop us, but it was not time to stick at rifles, so I passed my sword through his body at the same moment that one of the gunners brought his carbine down upon his head. He dropped instantly, and the hillman, at the sight of this fall, set up the most unearthly howl of horror and consternation. The sepoys who had been inclined to hang back came on again the moment he was disposed of, and it did not take us long to consummate our victory. Hardly a man of the enemy got out of the defile alive. What could Hannibal or Caesar have done more? Our own loss in the whole affair has been insignificant. 3 killed and about 15 wounded. Got their banner, a green wisp of a thing, with a sentence of the Koran engraved upon it. I looked after the action for the old chap, but his body had disappeared, though how or whither I have no conception. His blood be upon his own head. He would be alive now if he had not interfered, as the constables say at home, with an officer in the execution of his duty. The scouts tell me his name was Gulab Shah, and that he was one of the highest and holiest of the Buddhists. He had great fame in the district as a prophet and worker of miracles, hence the hubbub when he was cut down. They tell me that he was living in this very cave when Tamerlane passed its way in 1399 with a lot more bosh of that sort. I went into the cave, and how any man could live in it a week is a mystery to me, for it was a little more than 4 feet high and as damp and dismal a grotto as ever was seen. A wooden settle and a rough table were the sole furniture, with a lot of parchment scrolls with hieroglyphics. Well, he has gone, where he will learn that the gospel of peace and goodwill is superior to all his pagan lore. Peace go with him. Elliot and Chamberlain never caught the main body. I knew they wouldn't. So the honors of the day rest with me. I ought to get a step for it anyhow, and perhaps, who knows, some mention in the Gazette. What a lucky chance. I think Zamon deserves his telescope after all for giving it to me. Shall have something to eat now, for I am half-starved. Glory is an excellent thing, but you cannot live upon it. October 6, 11 a.m. Let me try to set down as calmly, as accurately as I can all that occurred last night. I have never been a dreamer or a visionary, so I can rely upon my own senses, though I am bound to say that if any other fellow had told me the same thing, I should have doubted him. I might even have suspected that I was deceived at the time had I not heard the bell since. However, I must narrate what happened. Elliot was in my tent with me having a quiet cheroot until about 10 o'clock. I then walked the rounds with the jemadar, and having seen that all was right, I turned in a little before 11. I was just dropping off to sleep, for I was dog-tired after the day's work, when I was aroused by some light noise, and looking around I saw a man, dressed in Asiatic costume, standing at the entrance of my tent. He was motionless when I saw him, and he had his eyes fixed upon me with a solemn and stern expression. My first thought was that the fellow was some Ghazi or Afghan fanatic who had stolen in with the intention of stabbing me, and with this idea in my mind I had all the will to spring from my couch and defend myself. But the power was unaccountably lacking. An overpowering rancour and want of energy possessed me. Had I seen the dagger descending upon my breast, I could not have made an effort to avert it. I suppose a bird, when it is under the influence of a snake, feels very much as I did in the presence of this gloomy-faced stranger. My mind was clear enough, but my body was as torpid as though I were still asleep. I shut my eyes once or twice and tried to persuade myself that the whole thing was a delusion, but every time that I opened them, there was the man, still regarding me with the same stony, menacing stare. The silence became unendurable. I felt that I must overcome my languor so far as to address him. I am not a nervous man, and never knew before that Virgil meant when he wrote, Ad hoisit faucibus ora. At last I managed to stammer out a few words, asking the intruder who he was and what he wanted. Lieutenant Heatherstone, he answered, speaking slowly and gravely. You have committed this day the foulest sacrifice and the greatest crime which is possible for a man to do. You have slain one of the thrice blessed and reverend ones, an arch-adept of the first degree, an elder brother who has trod the higher path for more years than you have numbered months. You have cut him off at a time when his labors promised to reach a climax, and when he was about to attain a height of occult knowledge, which would have brought man one step nearer to his Creator. All this you have done without excuse, without provocation, at a time when he was pleading the cause of the helpless and distressed. Listen now to me, John Heatherstone. When first the occult sciences were pursued many thousands of years ago, it was found by the learned that the short tenure of human existence was too limited to allow a man to attain the loftiest heights of inner life. The inquirers of those days directed their energies in the first place, therefore, to the lengthening of their own days, in order that they might have more scope for improvement. By their knowledge of the secret laws of nature, they were enabled to fortify their bodies against disease and old age. It only remained to protect themselves against the assaults of wicked and violent men who are ever ready to destroy what is wiser and nobler than themselves. There was no direct means by which this protection could be effected, but it was in some measure attained by arranging the occult forces in such a way that a terrible and unavoidable retribution should await the offender. It was irrevocably ordained by laws which cannot be reversed that anyone who should shed the blood of a brother who had attained a certain degree of sanctity should be a doomed man. Those laws are extant to this day, John Heatherstone, and you have placed yourself in their power. King or emperor would be helpless before the forces which you have called into play. What hope, then, is there for you? In former days, these laws acted so instantaneously that the slayer perished with his victim. It was judged afterwards that this prompt retribution prevented the offender from having time to realize the enormity of his offense. It was therefore ordained that in such cases the retribution should be left in the hands of the Kellahs, or immediate disciples of the holy man, with power to extend or shorten it at their will, exacting it either at the time or at any future anniversary of the day when the crime was committed. Why punishment should come on those days only, it does not concern you to know. Suffice it that you are the murderer of Gulab Shah, the thrice blessed, and that I am the senior of his 3 Kellahs, commissioned to avenge his death. It is no personal matter between us. Amid our studies, we have no leisure or inclination for personal matters. It is an immutable law, and it is as impossible for us to relax it as it is for you to escape from it. Sooner or later, we shall come to you and claim your life in atonement for the one which you have taken. The same fate shall be meted out to the wretched soldier Smith, who, though less guilty than yourself, has incurred the same penalty by raising his sacrilegious hand against the chosen of Buddha. If your life is prolonged, it is merely that you may have time to repent of your misdeed and to feel the full force of your punishment, and lest you should be tempted to cast it out of your mind and to forget it. Our bell, our astral bell, the use of which is one of our occult secrets, shall ever remind you of what have been and what is to be. You shall hear it by day, and you shall hear it by night, and it will be a sign to you that do what you may and go where you will, you can never shake yourself clear of the Kellahs of Gulab Shah. You will never see me more, accursed one, until the day when we come to you. Live in fear, and in that anticipation which is worse than death. With a menacing wave of the hand, the figure turned and swept out of my tent into the darkness. The instant that the fellow disappeared from my sight, I recovered from my lethargy which had fallen upon me. Springing to my feet, I rushed to the opening and looked out. A sepoy sentry was standing leaning upon his musket a few paces off. "You dog," I said in Hindustani. "What do you mean by letting people disturb me in this way?" The man stared at me in amazement. "Has anyone disturbed the Sahib?" he asked. "This instant, this moment, you must have seen him pass out of my tent." "Surely the Burra Sahib is mistaken," the man answered, respectfully but firmly. "I have been here for an hour, and no one has passed from the tent." Puzzled and disconcerted, I was sitting by the side of my couch, wondering whether the whole thing were a delusion brought on by the nervous excitement of our skirmish, when a new marvel overtook me. From over my head, there suddenly sounded a sharp, tingling sound like that produced by an empty glass when flipped by the nail, only louder and more intense. I looked up, but nothing was to be seen. I examined the whole interior of the tent carefully, but without discovering any cause for the strange sound. At last, worn out with fatigue, I gave the mystery up. Throwing myself on the couch, was soon fast asleep. When I awoke this morning, I was inclined to put the whole of my yesternight's experiences down to imagination, but I was soon disabused of the idea, for I had hardly risen before the same strange sound was repeated in my ear as loudly and to all appearance as causelessly as before. What it is or where it comes from, I cannot conceive. I have not heard it since. Can the fellow's threats have something in them that this be the warning bell of which he spoke? Surely it is impossible, yet his manner was indescribably impressive. I have tried to set down what he said as accurately as I can, but I fear I have omitted a good deal. What is to be the end of this strange affair? I must go for a course of religion and holy water, not a word to Chamberlain or Elliot. They tell me I am looking like a ghost this morning. Evening. Have managed to compare notes with Gunner Rufus Smith of the artillery, who knocked the old fellow over with the butt of his gun. His experience has been the same as mine. He has heard the sound too. What is the meaning of it all? My brain is in a whirl. October 10, 4 days later, God help us. This last laconic entry terminated the journal. It seemed to me that coming as it did after 4 days' complete silence, it told a clearer tale of shaken nerve and broken spirit than could any more elaborate narrative. Pinned onto the journal was a supplementary statement which had evidently been recently added by the General. From that day to this, it said, I have had no night or day free from the intrusion of that dreadful sound with its accompanying train of thought. Time and custom have brought me no relief, but on the contrary, as the years pass over my head, my physical strength decreases and my nerves become less able to bear up against the continual strain. I am a broken man in mind and body. I live in a state of tension, always straining my ears for the hated sound, afraid to converse with my fellows for fear of exposing my dreadful condition to them, with no comfort or hope of comfort on this side of the grave. I should be willing, heaven knows, to die, and yet, as each 5th of October comes round, I am prostrated with fear because I do not know what strange and terrible experience may be in storage for me. 40 years have passed since I slew Gulab Shah, and 40 times I have gone through all the horrors of death without attaining the blessed peace which lies beyond. I have no means of knowing in what shape my fate will come upon me. I have immured myself in this lonely country and surrounded myself with barriers because in my weaker moments my instincts urge me to take some steps for self-protection. But I know well in my heart how futile it all is. They must come quickly now, for I grow old, and nature will forestall them unless they make haste. I take credit to myself that I have kept my hands off the prussic acid or opium bottle. It has always been in my power to checkmate my occult persecutors in that way, but I have ever held that a man in this world cannot desert his post until he has been relieved in due course by the authorities. I have had no scruples, however, about exposing myself to danger, and during the Sikh and Sepoy wars I did all that a man could do to court death. He passed me by, however, and picked out many a young fellow to whom life was only opening and who had everything to live for, while I survived to win crosses and honors, which had lost all relish for me. Well, these things cannot depend upon chance, and there is no doubt some deep reason for it all. One compensation Providence has made me in the shape of a true and faithful wife, to whom I told my dreadful secret before the wedding, and who nobly consented to share my lot. She has lifted half the burden from my shoulders, but with the effect, poor soul, of crushing her own life beneath its weight. My children, too, have been a comfort to me. Mordaunt knows all, or nearly all. Gabriel we have endeavored to keep in the dark, though we cannot prevent her from knowing that there is something amiss. I should like the statement to be shown to Dr. John Easterling of Stranraer. He heard on one occasion this haunting sound. My sad experience may show him that I spoke truth when I said that there was much knowledge in the world which has never found its way to England. J.B. Heatherstone. It was going on for dawn by the time I had finished reading this extraordinary narrative, to which my sister and Mordaunt Heatherstone listened with the most absorbed attention. Already we could see through the window that the stars had begun to fade and a grey light to appear in the east. The crofter who owned the lurcher dog lived a couple of miles off, so it was time for us to be on foot. Leaving Esther to tell my father the story in such fashion as she might, we thrust some food in our pockets and set off upon our solemn and eventful errand. End of chapter, read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go, on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Mystery of Cloomber by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 16th. At the Hole of Cree. It was dark enough when we started to make it no easy matter to find our way across the moors. But as we advanced, it grew lighter and lighter until, by the time we reached Fullerton's cabin, It was broad daylight. Early as it was, he was up and about, for the Wigtown peasants are an early rising race. We explained our mission to him in as few words as possible, and having made his bargain, what Scott ever neglected that preliminary, he agreed not only to let us have the use of his dog, but to come with us himself. Mordaunt, in his desire for privacy, would have demurred at this arrangement, but I pointed out to him that we had no idea what was in store for us, and the addition of a strong, able-bodied man to our party might prove to be of the utmost consequence. Again, the dog was less likely to give us trouble if we had its master to control it. My arguments carried the day, and the biped accompanied us as well as his four-footed companion. There was some little similarity between the two, for the man was a towsy-headed fellow with a great mop of yellow hair and straggling beard, while the dog was of the long-haired, unkempt breed looking, like an animated bundle of oakum. All our way to the hall, its owner kept retailing instances of the creature's sagacity and powers of scent, which, according to his account, were little less than miraculous. His anecdotes had a poor audience, I fear, for my mind was filled with the strange story which I had been reading, while Mordaunt strode on with wild eyes and feverish cheeks, without a thought for anything but the problem which we had to solve. Again and again we topped an eminence and saw him look eagerly round him in the faint hope of seeing some trace of the absentee, but over the whole expanse of moorland there was no sign of movement or of life. All was dead and silent and deserted. Our visit to the hall was a very brief one, for every minute now was of importance. Mordaunt rushed in and emerged with an old coat of his father's, which he handed to Fullerton, who held it out to the dog. The intelligent brute sniffed it all over, then ran, whining a little way down the avenue, came back to sniff the coat again, and finally, elevating its stump of a tail in triumph, uttered a succession of sharp yelps to show that it was satisfied that it had struck the trail. Its owner tied a long cord to its collar to prevent it from going too fast for us, and we all set off upon our search, the dog tugging and training at its leash, its in excitement as it followed in the general's footsteps. On our way lay for a couple of 100 yards along the high road, and then passed through a gap in the hedge and on top of the moor, across which we were led in a bee-line to the northward. The sun had by this time risen above the horizon, and the whole countryside looked so fresh and sweet, from the blue, sparkling sea to the purple mountains, that it was difficult to realize how weird and uncanny was the enterprise upon which we were engaged. The scent must have lain strongly upon the ground, for the dog never hesitated nor stopped, dragging its master along at a pace which rendered conversation impossible. At one place, in crossing a small stream, we seemed to get off the trail for a few minutes, but our keen-nosed ally soon picked it up on the other side and followed it over the trackless moor, whining and yelping all the time in its eagerness. Had we not all three been fleet of foot and long of wind, we could not have persisted in a continuous, rapid journey over the roughest of ground, which the heather often high-nigh up to our waists. For my own part, I have no idea now, looking back, what goal it was which I expected to reach at the end of our pursuit. I can remember that my mind was full of the vaguest and most varying speculations. Could it be that the three Buddhists had had a craft in readiness off the coast, and had embarked with their prisoners for the east? The direction of their track seemed at first to favor this suspicion, for it lay in the line of the upper end of the bay, but it ended by branching off and striking directly inland. Clearly the ocean was not to be our terminus. By 10 o'clock we had walked close upon 12 miles, and were compelled to call a halt for a few minutes to recover our breath. For the last mile or two we had been breathing the long, wearing slope of the Wigtown hills. From the summit of this range, which is nowhere more than 1,000 feet in height, we could see, looking northward, such a scene of bleakness and dissolution as can hardly be matched in any country. Right away to the horizon stretched the broad expanse of mud and of water, mingled and mixed together in the wildest chaos, like a portion of some world in the process of formation. Here and there on the dun-colored surface of this great marsh, there had burst out patches of sickly yellow reeds and of livid greenish scum, which only served to heighten and intensify the gloomy effect of the dull, melancholy expanse. On the side nearest to us, some abandoned peat cuttings showed that ubiquitous man had been at work there, but beyond these few petty scars, there was no sign anywhere of human life. Not even a crow nor a seagull flapped its way over that hideous desert. This is the great bog of Cree. It is a saltwater marsh formed by an inroad of the sea, and so intersected it is with dangerous swamps and treacherous pitfalls of liquid mud that no man would venture through it unless he had the guidance of one of the few peasants who retained the secret of its paths. As we approached the fringe of rushes which marked its border, a foul, dank smell rose up from the stagnant wilderness, as from impure water and decaying vegetation, an earthly, noisome smell which poisoned the fresh upland air. So forbidden and gloomy was the aspect of the place that our stout crofter hesitated, and it was all that we could do to persuade him to proceed. Our lurcher, however, not being subject to the delicate impressions of our higher organization, still ran yelping along with his nose on the ground and every fiber of its body quivering with excitement and eagerness. There was no difficulty about picking our way through the morass, for whatever the 5 could go, we 3 could follow. If we could have had any doubts as to our dog's guidance, they would have all been removed now, for in the soft, black oozing soil, we could distinctly trace the tracks of the whole party. From these we could see that they had walked abreast, and furthermore, that each was about equidistant from the other. Clearly, then, no physical force had been used in taking the general and his companion along. The compulsion had been psychical and not material. Once within the swamp, we had to be careful not to deviate from the narrow track, which offered a firm foothold. On each side lay shallow sheets of stagnant water overlying a treacherous bottom of semi-fluid mud, which rose above the surface here and there in moist, sweltering banks, motted over with occasional patches of unhealthy vegetation. Great purple and yellow fungi had broken out in dense eruption, as though nature were afflicted with a foul disease, which manifested itself by this crop of plague spots. Here and there dark, crab-like creatures scuttled across our path, and hideous, fresh-colored worms wiggled and writhed amid the sickly reeds. Swarms of buzzing, piping insects rose up at every step and formed a dense cloud around our heads, settling on our hands and faces and inoculating us with their filthy venom. Never had I ventured into so pestilent and forbidding a place. Mordaunt Heatherstone strode on, however, with a set purpose upon his swarthy brow, and we could but follow him, determined to stand by him to the end of the adventure. As we advanced, the path grew narrower and narrower, until we saw by the tracks our predecessors had been compelled to walk in single file. Fullerton was leading us with the dog, Mordaunt behind him, while I brought up the rear. The peasant had been sulky and surly for a little while back, hardly answering when spoken to. But he now stopped short and positively refused to go a step further. "It's no canny," he said. "Besides, I ken where it will lead us to." "Where then?" I asked. "To the Hole of Cree," he answered. "It's not far from here, I'm a-thinking." "The Hole of Cree. What is that, then?" "It's a great muckle hole in the ground that gangs our down so deep that nobody could ever reach the bottom. Indeed, there are folk who says that is just the door leading into the bottomless pit itself." "You have been there, then?" I asked. "Been there?" he cried. "What would I be doing at the Hole of Cree? No, I've never been there, nor any other man in his senses." "Well, how do you know about it, then?" "My great-grandfather had been there, and that's how I can," Fullerton answered. "He was for one Saturday night, and he went for a bet. He did not like to talk about it afterwards, and he wouldn't tell her what befell him. But he was afeard of the very name. He's the first Fullerton that's been at the Hole of Cree, and he'll be the last for me. If he take my advice, Ye'll just give the matter up and gang name again, for there's not good to be this place." "We shall go on without you, or with you," Mordaunt answered. "Let us have your dog, and we can pick you up on our way back." No, he cried. "I'll not have my dog scared with boggles and running down, all Nick as it were hair. The dog shall bide with me." "The dog shall go with us," said my companion, with his eyes blazing. "We have no time to argue with you. Here's a £5 note. Let us have the dog, or by heaven, I shall take it by force and throw you in the bog if you'll hinder us." I could realize that Heatherstone of 40 years ago, when I saw the fierce and southern wrath which lit the features of his son. Either the bribe or the threat had the desired effect, for the fellow grabbed at the money with one hand, while with the other he surrendered the leash which held the lurcher. Leaving him to retrace his steps, we continued to make our way into the utmost recesses of the great swamp. The tortuous path grew less and less defined as we proceeded, and was even covered in places with water, but the increasing excitement of the hound and the sight of the deep footmarks in the mud stimulated us to push on. At last, after struggling through a grove of high bulrushes, we came on a spot the gloomy horror of which might have furnished Dante with a fresh terror for his Inferno. The whole bog in this part appeared to have sunk in, forming a great funnel-shaped depression, which terminated in the center in a circular rift or opening about 40 feet in diameter. It was a whirlpool, a perfect maelstrom of mud, sloping down on every side to the silent and awful chasm. Clearly, this was the spot which, under the name of the Hole of Cree, bore such a sinister reputation among the rustics. I could not wonder at its impressing their imagination, for a more weird or gloomy scene, or one more worthy of the avenue which led to it, could not be conceived. The steps passed down the declivity which surrounded the abyss, and we followed them with a sinking feeling in our hearts as we realized that this was the end of our search. A little way from the downward path was the return trail made by the feet of those who had come back from the chasm's edge. Our eyes fell upon these tracks at the same moment, and we each gave a cry of horror and stood gazing speechlessly at them. For there, in those blurred footmarks, the whole drama was revealed. 5 had gone down, but only 3 had returned. None shall ever know the details of that strange tragedy. There was no mark of struggle nor sign of attempt at escape. We knelt at the edge of the hole and endeavored to pierce the unfathomable gloom which shrouded it. A faint, sickly exhalation seemed to rise from its depths, and there was a distant, hurrying, clattering sound as of waves in the bowels of the earth. A great stone lay embedded in the mud, and this I hurled over, but we never heard thud or splash to show that it had reached the bottom. As we hung over the noisome chasm, a sound did at last rise to our ears out of its murky depths. High, clear, and throbbing, it tingled for an instant out of the abyss, to be succeeded by the same deadly stillness which had preceded it. I did not wish to appear superstitious, or to put down to extraordinary causes that which may have a natural explanation. That one keen note may have been some strange water sound produced far down in the bowels of the earth. It may have been that, or it may have been that sinister bell of which I had heard so much. Be this as it may, it was the only sign that rose to us from the last terrible resting place of the 2 who had paid the debt which had so long been owing. We joined our voices in a call with the unreasoning obstinacy with which men will cling to hope, but no answer came back to us save a hollow moaning from the depths beneath. Footsore and heart-sick, we retraced our steps and climbed the slimy slope once more. "What shall we do, Mordaunt?" I asked, in a subdued voice. "We can but pray that their souls may rest in peace." Young Heatherstone looked at me with flashing eyes. "This may be all according to occult laws," he cried, "but we shall see what the laws of England have to say about it. I suppose a Keller may be hanged as well as any other man. It may not be too late yet to run them down. Here, good dog! Good dog, here!" He pulled the hound over and set it on the track of the three men. The creature sniffed at it once or twice, and then, falling upon its stomach, with blistering hair and protruding tongue, it lay shivering and trembling, a very embodiment of canine terror. "You see," I said, "it is no use contending against those who have the powers at their command, to which we cannot even give a name. There is nothing for it but to accept the inevitable, and to hope that these poor men may meet with some compensation in another world for all that they have suffered in this, and be free from all devilish religions and their murderous worshippers," Mordaunt cried furiously. Justice compelled me to acknowledge in my own heart that the murderous spirit had been set on foot by the Christian before it was taken up by the Buddhists, but I forbore to remark upon it for fear of irritating my companion. For a long time I could not draw him away from the scene of his father's death, but at last, by repeated arguments and reasonings, I succeeded in making him realize how useless and unprofitable any further efforts on our part must necessarily prove, and in inducing him to return with me to Cloomber. Oh, the wearisome, tedious journey! It had seemed long enough when we had some slight flicker of hope, or at least of expectation, before us, but now that our worst fears were fulfilled, it appeared interminable. We picked up our peasant guide at the outskirts of the marsh, and having restored his dog, we let him find his own way home, without telling him anything of the result of our expedition. We ourselves prodded all day over the moors with heavy feet and heavier hearts, until we saw the ill-omened tower of Cloomber, and at last, as the sun was setting, found ourselves once more beneath its roof. There is no need for me to enter into further details, nor to describe the grief which our tidings conveyed to mother and to daughter. Their long expectation of some calamity was not sufficient to prepare them for the terrible reality. For weeks my poor Gabriel hovered between life and death, and though she came round at last thanks to the nurturing of my sister and the professional skill of Dr. John Easterling, she has never to this day entirely recovered her firmer vigor. Mordaunt, too, suffered much for some time, and it was only after our removal to Edinburgh that he rallied from the shock which he had undergone. As to Mrs. Heatherstone, neither medical attention nor change of air can ever have permanent effect upon her. Slowly and surely, but very placidly, she has declined in health and strength, until it is evident that in a very few weeks at the most, she will have rejoined her husband and restored to him the only thing which he must have grudged to leave behind. The Laird of Branksome came home from Italy restored in health, with the result that we were compelled to return once more to Edinburgh. The change was agreeable to us, for recent events had cast a cloud over our country life and had surrounded us with unpleasant associations. Besides, a highly honourable and remunerative appointment in connection with the university library had become vacant, and had, through the kindness of the late Sir Alexander Grant, been offered to my father, who, as may be imagined, lost no time in accepting so congenial a post. In this way we came back to Edinburgh very much more important people than we left in, and no further reason to be uneasy about the details of housekeeping. But in truth the whole household has been dissolved, for I have been married for some months to my dear Gabriel, and Esther is to become Mrs. Heatherstone upon the 23rd of the month. If she makes him as good a wife as his sister has made me, we may both set ourselves down as fortunate men. These mere domestic episodes are, as I have explained already, introduced only because I cannot avoid alluding to them. My object in drawing up this statement and publishing the evidence which corroborates it was certainly not to parade my private affairs before the public, but to leave on record an authentic narrative of a most remarkable series of events. This I have endeavored to do in as methodical a manner as possible, exaggerating nothing and suppressing nothing. The reader has now the evidence before him and can form his own opinions unaided by me as to the causes of the disappearance and death of Rufus Smith and of John Berthier Heatherstone, V.C. C.B. There is only one point which is still dark to me. Why the Khallas of Gulab Shah should have removed their victims to the desolate hole of Cree instead of taking their lives at Cloomber is, I confess, a mystery to me. In dealing with occult laws, however, we must allow for our own complete ignorance of the subject. Did we know more, we might see that there was some analogy between the foul bog and the sacrilege which had been committed, and that their ritual and customs demanded that just such a death was the one appropriate to the crime. On this point I should be sorry to be dogmatic, but at least we must allow that the Buddhist priests must have had some very good cause for the course of action which they so deliberately carried out. Months afterwards I saw a short paragraph in the Star of India, announcing that 3 eminent Buddhists, Lal Homi, Maudar Khan, and Ram Singh, had just returned in the steamship Deccan from a short trip to Europe. The very next item was devoted to an account of the life and services of Major General Heatherstone, who has lately disappeared from his country house in Wigtownshire, and who, there is too much reason to fear, has been drowned. I wonder if by chance there was any other human eye but mine which traced a connection between these paragraphs. I never showed them to my wife or to Mordaunt, and they will only know of their existence when they read these pages. I don't know that there is any other point which needs clearing up. The intelligent reader will have already seen the reasons for the general's fear of dark faces, of wandering men, not knowing how his pursuers might come after him, and of visitors from the same cause, and because his hateful bell was liable to sound at all times. His broken sleep led him to wander about the house at night, and the lamps which he burnt in every room were no doubt to prevent his imagination from peopling the darkness with terrors. Lastly, his elaborate precautions were, as he has himself explained, rather the result of a feverish desire to do something than in the expectation that he could really ward off his fate. Science will tell you that there are no such powers as those claimed by the Eastern mystics. I, John Fothergill West, can confidently answer that science is wrong. For what is science? Science is the consensus of opinion of scientific men, and history has shown that it is slow to accept a truth. Science sneered at Newton for 20 years. Science proved mathematically that an iron ship could not swim, and science declared that a steamship could not cross the Atlantic. Like Goethe's Mephistopheles, our wise professor's forte is stets verneinen. Thomas Didymus is, to use his own jargon, his prototype. Let him learn that if he will but cease to believe in the infallibility of his own methods, and will look to the East, from which all great movements come, he will find there a school of philosophers and of savants who, working on different lines from his own, are many thousand years ahead of him in all the essentials of knowledge. The End. Read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.